How do you make something unfinished? Because that's what a stroke is. If you lay a stroke down and don't lose it into the surrounding color field, it's unfinished. How do you make something unfinished finished? That's a tough problem. So if you're going to be painterly or stylistic in any way, how are you going to make it feel like it's a complete idea? That's a tricky deal.
Yeah.
You know, and so where's the consistency in that? If you're going to use broken line, broken soft edges, limited color, simplified form, why does it not look unfinished? How can a sketch be worthy of being framed? In other words, worthy of going in a gallery.
Okay.
And the trick to that is if it feels like it's saying what it needs to say. In other words, every stroke, for the most part, that you put down, or every mark in that artwork, if it's speaking the truth about what you're trying to say, this is a cheekbone that turns, that flows down into this structure, that comes forward and steps back. If those truths ring out, despite the technique, it'll feel finished. But if it's a placeholder, if you do a figure drawing and you just do a ball for the head, well, it could be anybody's head in almost any position. You got some sense of where that position is probably, but you haven't nailed it down in space, in position. It doesn't have the right character, and it doesn't have a unique character to the models there. But ideally, if you've got, and Charles Hawthorne said this, with every mark you make, it's a little bit of hyperbole, but it makes for a good teaching moment. With every mark you make, I know how you're feeling. If you were really wanting to get out of that classroom and go have lunch, that's going to come through in some level of that mark. It's going to be a lazy, impatient mark that's not speaking, not doing the work it needs to do. But if that tracks like an ant up over, if you can actually feel when you put that stroke on that cheekbone, the mound of this cheekbone. N.C. Wyeth said, and this I think is true, he said, if I was doing a painting of a guy reaping the fields with his scythe, let's say, he'd make those up for the most part later in his career. He said, by the end of the day, man, my neck and back was sore because I was feeling that same tension. It's like method acting.
Yeah.
He was actually, the method actor actually feels those emotions and sometimes suffers for it after the film's over. And he suffered for it because he dialed into that tension. So if I'm going to make this hand as opposed to that hand, those strokes, those moments, those color shifts, those gradations into the contours, in some manner or form, those have to be quite different because they're serving a different master. So, so finding that is incredibly complex, and the artist generally, not always, but generally, most of the great art movements have done this, is going to distill down. It's going to take a piece of the truth. It might just be by framing it. I'm not going to put all this, the rest of the room, we're just framed here, but there's a whole wide world around us that we don't get to see in this frame. But also, what am I going to do about that particular petal? Am I going to do every possible thing? Am I going to get out the magnifying glass and do a miniature rendering of it? Or am I going to just make it one stroke? Or leave that one out completely? And so we're always editing down. Right. So the trick, one of the tricks, is when we edit, let's do it out of a strength, out of a choice. Let's say, shoot, if I had more time, I'd put more petals in there. If I had more times, each petal would be more rendered petal. But let's do something that speaks to some poetic truth, some deeper truth about it. Maybe it's just a zigzag of yellow, or splatter with a brush or something like that. Maybe it's taken out completely, or it's made bigger, it's moved over, it's set back 3 feet. What are we going to do to change it or edit it in such a way that it supports our system of belief, our agenda? We're not journalists, we're editorialists. And what are we really trying to say about that? And the clearer you can be on that in terms of the craft, am I painting a front plane now? Well, that front plane should have something to do with this front plane. And that front plane there, all those front planes in flesh are going to have some relationship of color and value and such. And because they're all on an organic figure, they're going to have some relationship in terms of shape too. Because they're all going to be somewhat organic, figurative shapes. And that'll be very different than something that's clean lines and architectural.
So are you saying those decisions should be based on what your message is instead of just the level of detail?
Ideally. Now that might be very carefully thought out. That tends to be the kind of guy I am. But most artists in history don't think it out, but they feel it. Mm-hmm. You know, every time you work, your instincts are telling you that there's something wrong. It doesn't sit back, or it doesn't do some, or it's wrong scale, or whatever it is. You're making those critical choices oftentimes, and for most artists, even advanced artists, most of the time, without the critical thinking. But what I argue when I teach is that if you don't spend at least some time in the beginning critically thinking, then all you're doing is you're a slave to the system. You happen to get a teacher that you kind of liked, and you're a second-hand version of them. And oftentimes they can't quite tell you why it works. They just know that the guy that they got it from, or the girl they got it from, showed them that it did work, and it looked good, and it felt good. But why does it work? We can't figure those things out. So I'm always a why guy. I want to know why something works, and then I can play games with it. And then say, well, maybe I'll break that up. I'll flatten that space. You know, you know, tangents are bad. Maybe I'll use tangents for a specific reason. You know, for a counter reason or something. You can play with those ideas.
So you're saying the people that feel it instead of thinking about it, they're just instinctively copying somebody else, or?
Oftentimes, okay. Yeah. And there's good copying. I'll explain in a second. There's bad copying, because we all copy, and we all have to copy. If you go to most good museums, you'll see great artists have done copies of other great artists. That's how you learn. But if you're just a slave to that, if you've got a atelier or a school or whatever, they have the house style.
Right.
And now, how many students going through that are going to be able to transcend that style and make their own style? They're going to be influenced, and probably heavily influenced by that style, and they'll probably never get past it because they don't know what's in that style. And oftentimes the teacher isn't able to tell them what is in that style that really makes it work. They just have they have a process that they're teaching rather than a philosophy. And for me, we're visual philosophers, and we can get into deep meaning of life and man's inhumanity of man kind of philosophy, or just the philosophy of how form reacts to our mind. You know, how does your audience see things?